today we have decided to introduce measures permitting every citizen of the DDR to leave for the Federal Republic by any crossing points.
Out of the blue, the day had come. The wall was open now and there was no turning back. In East Berlin, the world ricocheted around the city. Astounded people left their homes and rushed to the border to see if it could really be true. On this freezing cold night, a growing tide of humanity headed for the checkpoints, surging forward so close to the small line of guards that the fog of their breaths joined as one. Overwhelmed, the guards gave in and opened the gates soon after 11:15. In this sweet moment, even the loathed and feared guards were okay after all. In a festive celebratory atmosphere, East Berliners seized the moment, marveling that they could do today what yesterday would have cost them their lives. It was too late now for the East German authorities to stem this unstoppable tide of people. Wave after wave continuously pushed onto the checkpoints and streamed out to the east. For most people, this was something they'd never been able to do, and it was something they simply had to do now.
We live here for 20 years and it's the first day, it's wonderful.
Many were just curious. Some were off to find family and friends, and others saw this as maybe their only chance to escape. Surely the government would change its mind. Surely it was a setup. But then again, could it possibly be a new beginning? At checkpoints around the city, more troops arrived. The mass exodus had authorities worried. So many people going, what if they didn't come back? It wasn't long before they had their answer. It was a Thursday in November 1989, and another harsh East Berlin winter was already smothering the remnants of autumn. It was a cold and gloomy morning, typical for that time of year. The sky, a forbidding grey, blended into the long concrete wall, and the watchtowers looming overhead, a far more forbidding sight. But residents were used to this. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall had kept the city divided, families split apart, and the people in isolation. This morning, though, they had other things on their minds, like the changes in other communist countries, with governments easing restrictions. Even right here in this stronghold of communist rule, there'd been huge protests for democratic rights. Of course, the long-held dream was for an end to the wall, of a united city, and maybe one day even a reunited Germany. But it was just a dream. Their children or grandchildren might one day see it, but few people realistically believed that they would live to see the day. On the morning of August 13th, 1961, East Berliners woke to a changed city. Overnight, the Soviet-controlled government had completely sealed off East Berlin from the west. Tanks secured critical areas, armed guards patrolled, while a civilian and military army dug holes, sank concrete posts into the ground, and stretched kilometers of barbed wire fencing and entanglements around the entire city. This was the first incarceration of what the West would call the Wall of Shame. Soon, thousands of prefabricated concrete blocks were brought in, and a high wall erected, topped with wire. Streets and stations accessing the border were torn up or closed. Telephone lines to the west were cut, and the city's main exit point, the Brandenburg Gate, was reinforced. Overnight, the many crossings from East Berlin to West Berlin were reduced to just 8. East Berlin's 17 million people were now effectively prisoners. Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939 threw the world into war. It ended with a defeated Nazi Germany and the city of Berlin divided between the Allied victors, the USA, the UK, and France controlling the West, and the Soviet Union the East. Soviet influence on Eastern Europe was on the rise, and relations with the West distinctly chilly.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
West Germany expanded rapidly, aided by Allied investment in rebuilding, while the East went backwards as the Soviet Union stripped assets and let things slide. The city of Berlin was situated deep inside the Eastern Bloc, its western half an oasis of freedom and prosperity. Initially, travel between the two sectors was relatively free, with 500,000 people crossing daily, including around 50,000 who commuted to well-paid jobs in West Berlin. The two economies were vastly different, as were the levels of freedom. Before long, East Berliners, mainly young, skilled and educated, began leaving in vast numbers. Like moths to a flame, unhappy East Germans were drawn to the city of East Berlin, the most likely escape route. The brain drain was having a disastrous effect on the economy. East Germany was hemorrhaging, its best and brightest slipping over the border. When the government began to restrict travel, it accelerated the rush. Over 3 million East Germans, almost a fifth of the population, had already gone when the government decided to play it tough. So the wall went up, and soon after a second inner fence. The area between the two was heavily guarded, a 100-meter bare and open zone known as No Man's Land, which quickly earned the name the Death Strip. The loss of freedom was painful, but separation from family and loved ones more so. By the time a baby born in East Germany would meet its father in West Germany, father would by now be a grandfather. Despite the risks, thousands still attempted to escape, not all successful. Some plans were simple and incredibly daring. This group of West Germans created a bridge of ladders that scaled the wall where it ran alongside a cemetery. Their East German mathematician friend had only seconds to elude guard dogs and soldiers and clamber across to safety, and to his fiancée. Tunneling was a common method. It was dangerous work, slow and exhausting, but sometimes paid off. Working 2 shifts over 6 months, this group dug over 130 meters from an old bakery cellar in West Berlin to an outhouse in the east. In June of 1963, President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin, addressing a huge crowd in front of the wall. The Cold War was a disturbing reality that threatened to become a nuclear war. In this struggle of freedom over repression, Berlin was at the front line.
I know of no town, no city that has been besieged for 18 years that still lives with the vitality and the force and the hope and the determination of the city of West Berlin. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
President Kennedy had earlier visited the wall, spending some reflective moments viewing the Brandenburg Gate behind its barricade of concrete and wire. Freedom has many difficulties, he said, and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. It was also in 1963 that negotiations between the two German governments resulted in limited visits from West Berlin into East Berlin for Christmas that year. These were the first civilian crossings since the wall went up more than 2 years ago. The wall was constantly upgraded and strengthened over the years. Even where it meandered through kilometers of what was once innocent-looking countryside, the wall was patrolled by guards and reinforced with vehicle traps. In the city itself, the war against escapees intensified. Houses along the border already had their windows bricked up to prevent people jumping to freedom. Now they were demolished, the workers themselves under heavy guards so they could not escape. The area was flattened, the land gutted and empty. There would be no crossing of this extended death strip, with its landmines, watchtowers, and machine guns. By 1980, the wall had reached its final, best-known, and most daunting form. US leaders continued to voice their opposition to this potent symbol of oppression.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Mr. Gorbachev was in fact already advocating reform. Vastly different from previous Soviet leaders, he was a progressive with an open and pragmatic worldview. He and Reagan had quickly established a rapport with a mutual desire to avoid catastrophic war. With a massively expensive military presence in Eastern Europe, the Soviet economy was stagnating. Gorbachev decided to hand self-control to the Eastern Bloc nations and announced the withdrawal of troops from East Germany.
Over 1,000 tanks have already been hauled to the Soviet Union. They are being tailored into unambiguously defensive structures. Motorized rifle divisions will be deprived of their tank regiments, their number of tanks being reduced by 40%.
The now independent Eastern Bloc nations quickly embraced their freedom by opening up to the West. Hungary was the first, removing its border defenses with Austria in August 1989. A few hundred East Germans slipped through immediately, but as a Warsaw Pact country, Hungary stopped the exodus. East Germans staunchly refused to return home, assembling in temporary camps and flooding the West German embassy. Confident that change was in the air, thousands made their way to the border, heading for the rail and road crossings into Austria. On September the 10th, human rights prevailed over political agreement. The Hungarian government announced on television that as of midnight that night, the patiently waiting East Germans were free to enter Austria and ultimately West Germany. The Iron Curtain would soon be reduced to shreds. East Germans looked on as democratic reform swept through the Eastern Bloc countries, while their own government continued its hardline approach. small protests grew into mass demonstrations, drawing 500,000 people in peaceful revolution. Hard on the heels of the Tiananmen Square massacre of protesters, East German leader Erich Honecker prepared the army for a Chinese solution to the growing dissent. Gorbachev had paved the way for the democratic reforms sweeping through Eastern Europe and was welcomed enthusiastically on his arrival in East Berlin for the nation's 40th anniversary. Wisely, he counseled the government to heed the people's discontent, warning Honecker, life punishes those who delay. Soon after, Honecker resigned and was replaced by Egon Krenz. The exodus from East Germany continued, now through Czechoslovakia. On November the 9th, hoping to salvage the situation, Krenz decided to officially allow travel to West Berlin, taking effect from the 17th. A hastily prepared statement was handed to a government spokesman. No starting date was specified.
Deshalb haben wir uns dazu entschlossen, heute
Today we have decided to introduce measures permitting every citizen of the DDR to leave for the Federal Republic by any crossing points.
Both sides of Berlin rejoiced in the biggest street party the city had ever seen. Civilians chipped away at the wall, taking souvenirs, and the government immediately set the army to work, making new official crossings.
We are walking around the streets and looking, all we can see.
And how do you feel now?
Wonderful. Wonderful, I can't say anything.
Thousands gathered at the famous and historic Brandenburg Gate, gateway to the city and the symbolic division between East and West. Jubilant and excited, they cheered as several East Germans opted for a more dramatic escape-style exit, clambering over the wall with a little help from friends.
I climbed over the wall and come and walk through the Brandenburg Gate.
I climbed over the wall and I just enjoyed the feeling to go here in this Brandenburger Tor.
I jumped over the wall.
You jumped over the wall?
Yeah. It's a great feeling.
I'm happy. I have been dreaming of this for years, and I don't know what to say. I'm happy.
This is something, and I don't have even the English words to explain how I feel.
But this was not an official border crossing, and the no man's land near the gate was literally a minefield. Uneasy guards moved in to hold the crowd at bay, but all remained peaceful. Throughout this historic night, the foot traffic continued unabated. East Germans entering and leaving the West at their leisure. Although the barricades and guards were still visibly present, they were already ghosts of the past. And freedom had come home. The Brandenburg Gate, the inspiring 18th century entry to Berlin, had for almost 30 years been physically blocked off from East Germans by concrete barricades and barbed wire. As work began on pedestrian crossings either side, it was an emotional moment as people from East and West witnessed the first breach in the wall, breaking down the physical and psychological barriers that had divided a nation. The following morning, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and East German Prime Minister Hans Modrow officially opened the crossing. Less than a year later, the last symbolic wall came down. After breaking down pockets of internal resistance and strong opposition from both the British and French governments, East and West Germany were formally reunited on October the 3rd, 1990. A wise man once said, "Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it." In 2003, Israel began construction of its own Berlin Wall, enclosing Palestine's Gaza Strip and the West Bank. The Israelis call it a security measure. Palestinians say it is the world's largest open-air prison. Also known as the Apartheid Wall, it dwarfs the Berlin Wall, covering a much greater area and up to 8 meters high. The wall is built well inside the 1967 borders, slicing off large areas of Palestinian land, making it illegal under international law. It's heavily guarded, with electrified sections, deep trenches either side, sophisticated electronics, unmanned aerial vehicles, and hundreds of sniper towers. Israeli security forces control the few exit and entry points, preventing Palestinians from traveling outside to jobs, schools, clinics, and shops. Frequently, blockades prevent food, medicines, fuel, and other supplies entering the Palestinian areas, creating a humanitarian crisis. 20 years after the Berlin Wall came down, Palestinians staged protests in the hope that they too may one day celebrate freedom. In 1989, a chain of events created the domino effect that toppled the Berlin Wall and diffused the Cold War time bomb. When the wall fell, many of the barriers to peace and communication in the world tumbled with it.
Мир лучшим, более спокойно. Отношения между странами, безусловно, улучшились и сохранились. Но я вам говорил, нам надо думать не только с учетом сегодняшней ситуации, надо думать о завтрашнем дне.
Es ist ja spannend und interessant, dass die Sehnsucht nach Freiheit, auch der Mut für die Freiheit zu kämpfen, immer wieder große Veränderungen ermöglicht hat. Und so ist eben der 9. November ein symbolträchtiger Tag in der deutschen Geschichte sowieso. Traum und Trauma in vielerlei Hinsicht, aber er ist eben in Form des 9. November 1989 auch und gerade die Erfüllung eines Traums.
The rubble of the wall is a new foundation. All we have to do is build on it.